There is one very underrated thing that if you incorporate it into your sewing can make the difference between getting professional results like this and getting results like this. I sewed both of these tank tops with the exact same pattern and the exact same fabric. The only difference is that with the tank top on the left, I pressed all of my seams as I went, and with the tank top on the right, I didn't press at all. So if you're someone who doesn't usually press while you sew and keep getting results that you are not happy with, then you're going to want to tune in today because we're going to be talking all about pressing and how you can use it to start getting professional results from your sewing. So first, let's talk about choosing an iron. So there's a few things that you want to look for when selecting an iron. You want to pick an iron that has a steam setting that you can turn on and off so that you can choose whether or not you want to press with steam. You also want to choose an iron that has a good range of temperatures available so that you have different temperature options for any fabric that you might want to press. So for example, I would say somewhere in the range of 5 or more temperature options would be really great to have. Another good feature to have is an auto shut off, where the iron will shut off after a certain period of time so that you don't have to worry if you accidentally left it on that it's going to burn your house down or something. So I find that's really helpful, but I do admit that it's a little bit annoying that it turns off while I'm in the middle of sewing if I haven't used it in the 15 or 30 minutes that it waits before it shuts off. But I think that the annoyingness of it is worth it because I do tend to forget to shut things off and I don't want to worry about it being left on all day while I'm gone. And of course, you don't need to break the bank on an iron. You can get some really expensive irons, but you really don't need to. This is the iron that I use and it's pretty inexpensive and it works great. I haven't had any trouble with it at all. So I would say somewhere in the $30 to $100 range is just fine for an iron. Now that you know how to choose an iron, we're going to talk about when to press. So you really want to make sure that you're pressing as you go. It's not going to work if you sew the whole thing together and then try to press everything at the end. You're not going to get it as flat as you want and it's not going to look as professional as you want. So typically what I do is I'll sew as many seams as I can before I get to the point where those seams are going to have to intersect with another seam that I sew. And then when I get to that point, I go ahead, take the garment to my ironing board and press all those seams nice and flat, and then take it back and sew the next seam that's going to intersect with some of the seams I've already sewn. So for example, if I'm making a shirt, I'll sew the shoulder seams and the side seams, then I'll take that to my ironing board and I'll press those seams flat before I put on the sleeves, because the sleeve is going to intersect with both the shoulder seam and the side seam, so we want to make sure we press those before attaching the sleeves. But if all of that is too much to keep track of, there's definitely no problem with just pressing every seam right after you sew it. So now that you know when to pull that iron out, let's talk about how to actually press your project with your iron. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're setting the iron to the right temperature because we do not want to be burning any holes in our project. So lots of irons have guides on the iron that will help you as a starting place to decide what setting to use. So my iron has a couple of different temperature settings and it shows on the actual iron what fabrics are appropriate for those temperature settings, which is super helpful. So it's really helpful if your iron has something like that. But as a general rule, natural fibers like cottons and linens and wools do a lot better at higher temperatures and with a steam setting, whereas synthetic fibers like polyesters, nylons, and things like that will do better with a lower temperature setting and with no steam. But the main thing to do is going to be to test a scrap piece of your fabric at the temperature setting that you want to use before touching your fabric with the iron, just to make sure that it's not going to burn your fabric and that it presses your fabric well, and that it doesn't do anything weird to your fabric like change the color or cause shininess where you press. I find that I get shininess after ironing more often with polyester type fabrics, and if you do find that your iron is making your fabric shiny, you can try pressing it with a press cloth. A press cloth is really simple. You don't need to go buy anything specifically called a press cloth. You can just use a piece of fabric that is a cotton or an organza, something that handles really high heat, and you want to make sure that it's either undyed or a really light color so that it won't transfer any weird dye stains to your fabric over time. So this is the press cloth that I use. Here it is. Just a piece of cotton muslin. Pretty simple. So you don't need anything fancy as your press cloth. I also like to use my press cloth anytime that I press with steam to protect the fabric. So I often use steam on natural fibers and especially things like wool. And when I use the steam settings, I always use my press cloth in between the fabric and the iron. So to use your press cloth, all you need to do is place the press cloth on top of the seam that you want to press, and then press the seam with your iron on top of the press cloth instead of directly on the fabric. Also, when pressing, it's usually better to press with an up and down motion, so pressing the iron down on the fabric, then lifting it up, pressing it down in the next area, holding it down a few seconds, then lifting it up, and so on, versus sliding the iron around on the fabric, because that can get the fabric a little wonky and out of shape and stretch it out a bit. But I have to admit that I am guilty of sometimes sliding the iron around on the fabric instead of pressing up and down, because it's a little bit faster and it usually is just fine as long as the fabric is stable and doesn't get stretched out easily. You definitely don't want to do that if the thing that you're pressing is cut on the bias and will stretch out. And finally, there are a couple of different ways you can press your seam allowances when you press your seams. One of the most common ways is to press the seam allowances open so that one seam allowance goes in one direction and the other seam allowance goes in the other direction. And this is the method that I usually use because I find it gets the most crisp and flat and nice seam. The other most common method of pressing seam allowances is to press both of the seam allowances together towards the back of the garment. This is the method that I like to use when I sew things on my serger, where the seam allowances are actually sewn together in the serger, so they're not actually separate and can't be pressed open. I'll also do that when I'm sewing things like flat felled seams and French seams, where once again the seam allowances can't be pressed open, so I'll press them towards the back instead. Alright, so there you have it. I hope that I've convinced you that you should definitely be pressing while you're sewing. I'm so passionate about this subject. I find that so many people do not do this, and it makes an absolutely huge difference in the kind of results that you get. And I promise you, you'll be so much happier with the things that you sew if you implement pressing and give your iron some love. So I hope that you subscribe for more sewing tips and tutorials, and I will see you in the next video.